Hello and welcome to section 6 of our reading. Today we're going to read this section to form nuanced understandings of Socrates' arguments that were provided during the summary section of section 6. We're going to draw upon our prior knowledge that we got from that summary, and we're going to trace the development of arguments related to pursuing the good rather than, as Callicles suggested beforehand, pursuing pleasure. We will trace the development of arguments that explain what a healthy mind is. And if you've watched the summary, these two should actually be quite familiar concepts, or should be covering quite familiar concepts. So could you draw me a picture, please, for an APK to draw, so basically a picture that represents you in a situation where you had to demonstrate some kind of restraint. Okay, now let's read the summary. So Callicles shifts from commending mere quantity of pleasure to admitting that there are qualitative differences between pleasures. So what that means in plain English is that originally Callicles would just say, go for pleasure. Then this allows Socrates to reintroduce the distinction between means and ends. He argues that better pleasures are those whose longer term effects are good, which in turn confirms that pleasure is not the good, since the good is something pleasure can aim for. So that's how we're making a distinction. And notice how this wasn't something I brought up in my summary. Okay, the fact that pleasure is a means to the good when used properly is something that's being developed as we go through a more nuanced reading. Okay, the good life then becomes a matter of foresight. Didn't mention that at all in the summary we said before, not immediate feeling response, and therefore arguably requires some expertise. We mentioned the concept of expertise before. We didn't talk about having the foresight to be able to plan and aim for the good, which requires a source of expertise. We never really developed that argument in the summary. Socrates reminds Callicles of his earlier distinction between empirical knacks, whose goal is pleasure, and the true branches of expertise, which the goal is good. He counts rhetoric as a knack and criticizes all the great figures of Athenian history as mere flatterers of the populace, before sketching an outline of what true rhetoric would aim to do for its audience. In short, the expertise required to enable someone to live the good life is not the rhetoric Gorgias practices and teaches. Okay, remembering Gorgias is a public speaker and a sophist as well, and this is his house. So, if anything has struck you as new or that you think is really important, I'd like you to spend some time now to just take some notes. Alrighty, Callicles. I've been listening to you for quite a while now, Socrates, and I've been saying yes and on cue. But what I've been thinking about is the adolescent delight you take in seizing on any concession someone makes to you, even if he means it as a joke. Do you really think that I or anyone else would deny that there are better or worse pleasures? Oh no, you are behaving terribly, Callicles. First you claim that such and such is the case, and then that it isn't the case. This is the way you treat a child, and it's so dishonest. I set out on this discussion in the belief that you are my friend, and so wouldn't deliberately deceive me, but it turns out that I was wrong, and now I've got to make the best of my situation, as the old saying goes, and accept this offering of yours. It seems that what you're saying now is that there are better and worse pleasures. Is that right? Yes. So there you go. We've got Socrates pretending to be offended and annoyed because Callicles says one thing and then he says another, and he believes that that's Callicles practicing some kind of deception. And then Callicles is forced into a position where he has to concede, which means to admit, despite the fact that he doesn't want to, that that there are good and there are better and worse pleasures. Socrates, well, beneficial pleasures are good and harmful ones are bad, aren't they? Yes, so there's a definition of what is pleasurable. That there's a definition of good and bad pleasures. Aren't they beneficial if they have a good effect and harmful if they have a bad effect? Yes, I agree. Are you thinking, for example, that the physical pleasures of eating and drinking that we were talking about long ago, of how some of them make the body healthy and strong or good in some way or the other. Would you call a pleasure of this kind good? and those which produce the opposite results bad. Yes, that is it. Does the same go for unpleasant experiences? Are some good and some bad? Of course. So there we have a confirmation that unpleasant experiences or distress is also good and bad. Distress does not equal bad. All right. I think you should take some notes. Okay. Does the same go for pleasant experiences? Yes, of course. Good. Experiences are the ones we should be going for, shouldn't we? Whether they are pleasant or unpleasant. They're what we should be concerned with, aren't they? Yes. And hadn't we better avoid bad ones? Obviously. Yes, because Polis and I decided, as you may remember, that the good in some form or other should be the reason for doing anything. Do you agree? Do you think, as Polis and I do, that all activity aims at the good, and that the good should not be a means towards something else, but should be the goal of every action? Are you going to support us and make it three? Yes. So here we have something which wasn't developed before. You've got that means to an ends discussion here. So previously, Callicles would have argued that the point of a procedure or an action is to pursue pleasure, and pleasure equals good. Now Callicles is forced to admit that all actions should be directed to the good, because there are both bad and good pleasures, as there are bad and good unpleasant experiences. So yes, everything we do or experience should aim towards the good. Okay, time to take a note. It follows the good in some form should be the goal of pleasant activities, as much as any other kind of activity, rather than pleasure being the goal of good activities. I'd probably write that down as a quote. The reason for that is because it outlines a major aspect of Socrates' philosophy, okay, or Plato's. Callicles, that's right. Now, is just anyone competent to separate good pleasures from bad ones, or does it always take an expert? It takes an expert. So this is where, as we referred to the summary, that expertise is required to know how to pursue the types of pleasures that produce the good. And here we have a long monologue from our man Socrates. I think we better remind ourselves of another view I happened to express while talking to Polus and Gorgias. As you may remember, I held that there are some procedures which are restricted to pleasure. That's all they have to offer, and which fail to distinguish themselves better and worse. But I also held that there are other procedures which I do know, which do know what's good and what's bad. I propose cookery as a typical example of a procedure which is concerned with pleasure, and I call it a knack rather than an area of expertise. And medicine is a typical example of an area of expertise which is concerned with what is good. Now, for God's sake, Callicles, and for the sake of our friendship, please don't think it's all right for you to play games with me and answer my questions in any old how. Answer my questions any old how without caring whether you contradict what you really think. And at the same time, please don't treat what you hear from me as if I were playing games with you. Are you somehow unaware that there's nothing which even a relatively unintelligent person would take more seriously than this issue we're discussing? The issue is how to live one's life. Bang. So Socrates really admits the whole point of this dialogue here. Through this discussion, what we really are looking at is how to live a good life. That's the main aim. Take a note. Okay, so the life you're recommending to me involves mainly activities of addressing assembled people, rhetorical training, and the kind of political involvement you and your sort engaged in. But is that the right way to live, or is this philosophical life of mine better? And if so, what makes it better? So perhaps it would be best for us to distinguish these two ways of life and the lines along the lines I tried to talk about just now. And then once we've agreed that they're different, we should try, if there really are two ways of life, to see how they differ and which of them is the one to follow. Anyway, you may not yet you may not yet have understood my point. No, I haven't, says Callicles. All right, I'll try to explain myself better. You and I have already agreed that there is good and there's pleasure, and that good and pleasure are not identical. We've also agreed that there are certain processes and procedures for obtaining each of these two ways of pursuing respectively pleasure and the good. But before I go any further, I'd better find out whether or not You accept even this, do you? Yes, I do. Socrates. All right then. I wonder whether you'll go along with the idea I suggested to our friends here. That is, I wonder if you thought that at the time there was a right. I told them, to my mind, cookery was the knack rather than a branch of expertise, as medicine is. And I went on to say that one of these processes, medicine, in fact, had considered both the nature of the object. Considered both the nature of the object it looks after and the reasons for its actions, and could therefore explain its results. That's really important. It's nuanced. It's a little bit of detail that we never really caught before. I guess one of the reasons why medicine, from his point of view, can be considered as an expertise is because it considers its results and it also considers the nature of the object that it's supposed to be looking after. Yeah. And that is its motivation for its actions. I don't know. I mean, that's a bit of a nuanced argument. It's probably a tangent, but it's actually really important. Okay? Just write it down if you feel you need to. Pleasure, however, is the sole point of the other one's attentions. So what they were saying here is, with respect to cookery, it's just about pleasure. It's not necessarily about considering the object it's supposed to look after. Okay, it's just about the pleasure in and of itself. There's absolutely no expertise involved in the way that it pursues pleasure. It hasn't considered either the nature of pleasure or the reason why it occurs. It's a completely irrational process. It hasn't itemized things at all, so to speak. All it can do is remember a routine which has become ingrained by habituation and past experience, and that's also what it relies on to provide us with pleasant experiences. Do you think it's a satisfactory account? That's the main question. But then I also want to ask whether you think there are practices whose province, which means area of responsibility, is the mind rather than the body, which are analogous in the sense that while some of them involve expertise and work out in advance what will be best for the mind, others don't care about that. So again, like medicine, when we said medicine cares about the body, works out what's in the best interest of it, and then behaves accordingly, there must be some experiences that do the same for the mind. They work out what's best for the mind and behave accordingly, and maybe pleasure could be a side effect of those procedures. But basically, it's not about the pursuit of pleasure, it's about pursuing what is best for the mind, okay? All right, so there's the analogy. I think you might want to make an analogy between medicine and between the purpose of positive processes for the mind. Okay, best for the mind. Others don't care about that, as was the case with cookery, and have restricted their thinking to how the mind gets pleasure. Not only have they not given any consideration to whether there might be qualitative differences between pleasures, they're simply not interested in anything except gratifying the mind, whether that is to its advantage or to its disadvantage. The point is, Callicles, that I think these practices exist. And I maintain that pandering like this to the pleasure of the body or to the mind or whatever, without taking into consideration the question of better or worse, is flattery. So flattery is when we pander to the need to just provide pleasure rather than thinking about what's in the best interest of the object or subject concerned. Take a note. Notice again, that's what I mean about developing more nuanced arguments. We didn't get those kind of definitions when we were going through the summary, but we definitely get them elaborated on and well articulated here as we read through. All right. So remember, nuance means detail, refinement, and that's what we're doing as we read. We're definitely adding to the summaries that we had provided beforehand, okay? What about you? Do you endorse this view of mine or disagree? Oh, I agree. As a favour to Gorgias, and so that the discussion isn't left incomplete. Now, can this only happen to one mind at a time rather than to two or more? No, it can happen to two or more. So if there's a whole crowd of people, it's possible to gratify all their minds at once without considering what's best for them. Is that right? Oh, I'd say so. Can you tell me which activities have this effect? Perhaps it would be better for me to ask you to specify questions and for you to tell me whether or not you think the activity I've mentioned does have this effect. Is that all right with you? Let's start with playing the reed pipe. Do you think it belongs to this category, categories? its sole purpose is to give us pleasure without worrying about anything else? Yeah, I think so, says Callicles. So here he says, playing the reed pipe is just an experience in providing people with pleasure. It has no other or further consideration for what is best for the mind, which should be its sole concern if it wasn't a knack but an expertise. All right. And for all other related activities like playing the kithara, that's just an instrument in competitions? Yes. And what about training choirs to sing dithyrambic poetry you've composed? Do you think it belongs here? I mean, do you think that Synesius, the son of Meles, is the slightest bit interested in having his words improve his audience rather than finding a way to gratify a packed theatre? Well, it's clear, at least in the case of Synesius, that he's only interested in giving pleasure, Socrates. What about his father, Meles? Do you get the impression that he's composing music for the Kithara? His objective is, sorry, do you get the impression that when he's composing music for the Kithara, his objective is to maximize his audience's moral welfare? Actually, it might be truer to say in his case that he doesn't even aim at maximizing their pleasure, since I find his singing rather offensive. But anyway, what do you think about the Kithara music and dithyrambic poetry in general? Do you think they were invented to give pleasure? Yes, I do. So these are examples of forms of flattery, guys, or knacks. Knacks being employed to engage in flattery. And flattery is when you try to provide the mind with pleasure rather than provide it with what it needs in order to improve itself or to be good. All right. What about the grand, awesome pursuit, the composition of tragedies? What is the object of their efforts? Do you think the point of its earnest endeavours is merely to please the audience, or does it also struggle to avoid expressing sentiments which, for all their delightful charm, are morally wrong? To include in speeches and songs sentiments which are actually harsh and beneficial rather are not people enjoying hearing them? Which of these two purposes do you think tragedy is designed for? Now, keep in mind, when Socrates is talking about tragedy, he's talking about ancient Greek tragedies. And look, he's a bit of a snob, our man Socrates, because I think literature can do a lot that philosophy can do as well, maybe even some more. It just provokes people into realizing certain moral truths or considering moral truths, etc. But he's basically saying that it's solely designed to gratify the mind, not actually provide it with any tools for bettering itself. And I'm not quite sure I agree with that, but that's where Socrates is coming from. So, well, there can no doubt about that, Socrates. It's more interested in pleasure and in gratifying an audience. Socrates. And isn't that more or less how we described flattery a short while ago, Callicles? Yes. Next, suppose poetry was stripped of its music, its rhythm, and its meter. We'd be left with nothing but words, wouldn't we? Of course. Words spoken, in fact, before a large crowd, before the assembled people. Agreed. So poetry is like a kind of popular oratory. Now, popular oratory is another way of saying public speaking, and that's also another way of saying rhetoric, because rhetoric usually, well, public speaking is one of the arts of rhetoric, which is designed to persuade, right? And that means that once we look at music and we break it down, it's basically engaged in a form of flattery because it's designed to delight the mind and probably persuade through it. Okay? I suppose so. And popular oratory is just another way of saying rhetoric. I mean, do you think poets are the rhetoricians of the theatre? I do. So we're faced with a kind of rhetoric which is addressed to the assembled population of men, women, and children all at once, slaves as well as free people. And it's a kind of rhetoric we find we can't approve of. I mean, we describe it as flattery. That's right. All right. What are we to make of this kind of rhetoric which is addressed to the Athenian assembly and the assemblies of other states which are attended by free male citizens? Do you think that when rhetoricians speak, they want what's best for their audience? Do you think they intend their fellow speeches to have the effect of perfecting their fellow citizens? Or do you think that they really are no different from poets? In other words, that their objective is the gratification of their fellow citizens and that common good means less to them than their own private concerns. So again, he's saying when you try to persuade someone of your own private concerns, you must employ a form of flattery which allows you to persuade them of your argument rather than getting them to realize the truth. So again, it's about gratifying through using rhetorical devices your fellow citizens, giving them what they want to hear in a way that's engaging and stimulates the mind, but not necessarily anything that is concerned with or has to be concerned with the common good. All right. And that's a form of flattery. I think you need to take a note. Restrict their dealings with the members of these assemblies. Isn't there, to your mind, something patronising about the way they restrict their dealings with the members of these assemblies to trying to gratify them and don't take the slightest interest in whether or not they're made better or worse people in the processes? There's no simple answer to your question as there was to the other one. There are speakers who are motivated by concern for their fellow citizens, but there are also others who answered your description. So this is a section where Callicles is saying some public speakers actually try to achieve the moral good and to actually perfect or improve people. They are concerned with the object they're trying to care for, and that's their prime motivation. So he's basically saying some public speaking is not flattery. I disagree, Socrates. And of course, Socrates has a counter argument, as he always does. That's all I need. If the activity is twofold like that, then one of its aspects is presumably flattery and popular oratory of the contemptible sort, while the other is the admirable procedure of trying to perfect the human minds of one's fellow citizens, and of struggling to ensure that the speeches one delivers have the highest moral content, whether or not it makes people enjoy listening to them. But you've never come across this latter kind of rhetoric. If you can think of any rhetoricians who fits this description, why don't you tell me his name? Certainly, I can think of any contemporary. I certainly can't think of any contemporary rhetoricians anyway. Well, can you name a single rhetorician from the past who's supposed to have been instrumental from his very first public speech onwards in changing the Athenian people from a terrible state they'd been in before to a better one? If you can, please do so because I don't know who it is. Well, what about Themistocles? People say he was a good man, don't they? And then there are common. Then there are Simon, Miltiades, and Pericles, who only recently died, and you actually heard them speak. Yes, Callicles, they were good men, all right. That is, if you if your earlier description of goodness was true, and it consists in satisfying your own and others' desires. But that's not the case. If there's some truth in the conclusions, the subsequent discussion led us and jeez, I know the word, inexorably towards, and we should satisfy only desires whose fulfillment make us better people, not those whose fulfillment makes us worse. And we decided that this whole area was a matter for expertise. Well, can you say any of the men that you mentioned were good in that way? I don't know what to say. So what Socrates is basically saying is, can you say that those public speakers are different from other rhetoricians? They're not engaged in flattery, but they're actually engaged in bettering people and improving people, because that's what a good action is about. A good action takes the welfare of its subject, or object probably, into account first and is motivated by that, wants to do better by that rather than just to provide some kind of pleasure. All right. You'll come up with something if you research in the right way. Let's make an unhurried look then and see whether any of them were good in that sense. So saying good in the sense that they aim to better people rather than just flatter them and provide the mind with some kind of delight and pleasure. Now, speeches delivered by a good man, someone who wants to be the best for his audience, aren't aimless but have a purpose, don't they? It's the same with all other craftsmen too. Each of them bears in mind his particular task and doesn't select and apply his material aimlessly, but with the purpose of getting the objects he's making to acquire a certain form. If you need examples, look at painters, builders, shipwrights, and craftsmen you like, in fact. Each of them organizes the various components he works with into particular structures and makes them accommodate and fit one another until he's formed the whole into an organized and ordered object. That's what all craftsmen do, including the ones we're talking about not long ago, who deal with the human body, trainers and doctors, I mean. They order and organize the body in a way. Are we in agreement with this or not? So here Socrates is saying, look, if you can't think about how they actually perform, these public speakers aim for achieving the good rather than just flattery and using rhetoric. And flattery, again, is basically using appealing to the mind's pleasures without any regard to the actual betterment of the mind that you're trying to flatter. All right, if you can't think of any of those examples, let's move away from that. And here in this section, think about tradesmen and how they organize and reorganize and shape and fashion different components and assemble them to achieve some kind of good thing. All right. And the same can be said for trainers or doctors. Okay. I dare say you're right, says Callicles. So it takes organization and order to make a house good, does it? And without these qualities and houses, it's worthless. Yes. And the same goes for ships. Yes. And for our bodies too, we're saying yes. What about the mind? Can a disorganized mind be a good thing? A mind, or does it take organization in order to make the mind a good as well? We have to think so. The preceding argument leaves us no choice. All right. So, an expert, somebody who is able to perform some kind of expertise, needs to understand that their mind is also a product of their efforts and their labors. So you want to create the good mind, and to have the good mind, you have to approach the creation of the good mind from the point of view of a tradie or a doctor or a trainer. You have to approach it from the point of view of constructing a highly ordered, rational thing that is then able to produce other good products or help other people have good minds. These weren't arguments that we developed really well when we're going through the summary, but they are developed quite well now. So I need you to stop for a minute and take some notes about how we would create a good mind. All right, so Callicles then is forced to say, yes, you're right. You have to organize the mind in a way that would allow you then to have a good mind. All right. So Socrates says, now what do we call the effect of organization and order on the body? I suppose you mean health and fitness. Yes. Next then, what do you call the effect of organization and order on the mind? What's the equivalent term to health in this case? Can you think of one? Why don't you tell us yourself, Socrates? All right, I will, if that's what you prefer. If you think I'm right, please tell me. But if you think I'm wrong, don't let me get in the way of it. Show me why I'm wrong. In my opinion, we describe the processes in which we organize the body as healthy because they cause health. So health is one of the goods, guys. It's one thing we want to achieve. Health has got the benefit for the subject concerned. It's not just about pleasure. So obviously we might refer to a good mind as a healthy mind. And whatever else constitutes a good physical state, is that right or not? And it is. And we describe the processes for which we organize and order the mind as law or convention because they make the mind law-abiding and orderly, which is to say, they imbue the mind with justice and self-control. Agreed. All right. So he's saying, and this wasn't brought up in the summary, that we say a good mind is a very law-abiding and correctly ordered mind, structured really well, and that allows us to have self-control and to act with the acts of justice. You probably need to write that down. You also need to put here that if the body is described as healthy, we might need to describe the mind that way as well. Okay, so moving forward. So there are qualities with which so these are the qualities with which that excellent rhetorical expert of ours will be aiming for in his dealings with people's minds, whether he's talking or acting or giving or taking. He'll constantly be applying his intelligence to find ways for justice, self-control, and goodness in all of its manifestations to enter his fellow citizens' minds, and for injustice, self-indulgence, and badness in all manifestations to leave. Do you agree or not? I agree. All right. So that's kind of important. He's basically saying to be a good person, to be a good public figure, you have to pursue the good. And that means that you remember pursuing the good is different from pursuing pleasure. It's okay if pleasure is a way towards the good, but you pursue the good first. So a good public speaker doesn't flatter or ingratiate or indulge an audience or other people. It tries its way to make that mind perform acts that are just. It tries to provide it with some kind of structure and rationality. It helps it be um, restrained and ordered, and it gets rid of self-indulgence, injustice, and any other form of badness. That needs to kind of be taken down. You need to talk about the role of a good public speaker, because obviously, in a way, that's kind of what he's saying good leaders or good politicians should be doing. That's their main game. All right, Callicles is forced to agree. You see, Callicles, what's the point of giving someone whose body is ravaged by disease lots of wonderfully pleasant food or drink or whatever if that's not going to increase his chances of getting better in the slightest, or on the contrary, it's even, as an impartial view suggests, going to decrease them, am I right? Well, I dare say you are. Yes, I can't see that life is worth living if a person's body is in a terrible state. He's bound to have a terrible life, isn't he? Yes. Now, isn't it normal medical practice to allow a healthy person to satisfy his desires by eating, drinking as much as he wants when he's hungry or thirsty, for instance, but almost never to let a sick person have his fill of what he desires? Do you agree with me about this? Yes, says Callicles. The same goes for the mind, doesn't it, Callicles? As long as it's in a bad state, which is to say ignorant, self-indulgent, immoral, or irreligious, we may prevent it from doing what it desires and have it keep strictly to a regimen which will make it better. Do you agree or not? I do, because that's actually better for the mind, isn't it? Yes. So for a person who's in a bad state of mind, and that's outlined here in brackets, you should be able to force them to behave in a way or action that purifies the mind and makes it a good thing so it can achieve the good in its own welfare. Take a note. And you should add to that, part of being a good mind is so that you can not, well, the point that it's immoral here, you have to be moral. So you're improving society's welfare at the same time too. Yes, says Callicles. Now, to prevent it from doing what it desires is to discipline it, wouldn't you say? Yes. So discipline is better for the mind than indulgence, you were recommending not long ago. Of course, Callicles is forced to say yes. So at the end of that, we kind of get a sense that a healthy mind is a highly ordered, structured mind that is capable of being rational, um, and that we need to be able to force the mind when it's badly or when it's good to self-restrain itself and to discipline itself so that it can constantly improve. In fact, discipline is about forcing the sick mind, or a mind that might be getting sick, into restructuring and reordering itself in ways that allows it to improve and be good. And that's an act of, well, discipline is like the same as medicine, where medicine tries to do that to the body and make the body healthy. Discipline makes the mind healthy. Right, so that's something that you really should be reflecting on. A healthy mind is a law-abiding and orderly mind. It is a healthy mind also if it has the capacity to engage itself in discipline and improve itself along the ways that had been mentioned previously. So let's look at our goals. We did draw upon prior knowledge, but it's pretty easy to say. We did explore nuance. There are a lot of things that were brought up, subtle arguments that were brought up as we read this, and you were taking notes that that we didn't bring up in the summary. We traced the development of what we should do if we need to pursue the good. It's quite clear that you should be pursuing pleasures only if they allow you to achieve the good, and you leave them if they don't have bad. But again, we got more nuanced arguments here because the good really seem to be about like good experiences seem to be about experiences that had the welfare and the betterment of its subject in mind, not just pleasure. Whereas bad experiences tended to be experiences that were just about flattery or pleasure. And also we got a great definition of what flattery was in this section, which we didn't get in the summary, where we talked about the fact that flattery is engaging in a knack or engaging in a sham, I like to call them shams, that in turn just provide you with pleasure. They don't aim to, or they don't have the capacity to look after your welfare or betterment. Okay? They could indeed cause harm. We definitely had a look at what a healthy mind is, talking about the ordered state, the law-abiding state, the conventional state, talking about that idea of being healthy, just like the body. And we know that a good analogy would be that the medicine is to the body as discipline is to the mind. Okay, discipline puts in place behavioral regimes or regimens that allow us to consider the welfare of the mind and in turn engage in experiences that improve it and allow it to be bettered. Whereas self-indulgence is the complete opposite. It's pursuing pleasure for pleasure's sake, and we don't really have the needs and concerns of the mind in place. So again, another definition for good, which is provided through this whole section, is about considering the betterment of the actual subject of the practice. Okay, and that's it. Thank you.